Today we're going to be doing a valve adjustment on a Honda J series engine. Now this is the J35 series engine. It's on a Saturn Vue. It's a 2007 all-wheel drive. But Honda engines, models such as the Ridgeline, the Odyssey, the Acura, the Pilot, the Legend all carry the J35 engine, so the techniques and things applied in this video will apply pretty much exactly on those models as well of the Honda vehicle. But the techniques in this video really apply to any combustion engine with valves, so follow along, you might learn something new. So valve adjustment, it could be part of a routine maintenance. Maybe your car's got to around 5,000 miles and it's time to adjust the valves. Or it could be the result of something more serious where you need to adjust the valves for the car to stop, say, misfiring, for example. Most engines will clear 150, 200,000 miles without a valve adjustment, but it is a maintenance step I'm doing today. I'm going to show you how to do it. If you're replacing valve cover gaskets, so for routine maintenance, or maybe you have an oil leak at the front or rear bank there of cylinders, then follow along. We're going to be doing that as well. That includes the valve cover gasket, the spark plug gaskets, say maybe your spark plugs have oil on them, you want to redo your spark plug gaskets, and even the bolt gaskets as well. So we're going to do all that today. So today, like I said, we're doing valve adjustment, but you might have heard valve clearance adjustment, valve clearance, valve lash, exhaust valve adjustment, intake valve adjustment, clearance adjustment, all these different synonyms, they mean exactly the same thing. And that is the clearance between the valve and the rocker arm or lifter, depending on engine design. And this is called valve lash. So here we're doing a valve lash adjustment or valve adjustment on a Honda J series engine. So I'll just talk briefly about this engine real quick and it will tie into why we're doing this. So this Honda J series engine here in the Saturn Vue, it's a Honda J35 engine, it's a SOHC valve train, VTEC, V6 engine with 4 valves per cylinder. What does all that mean? Let's explain really quickly. Now SOHC is the valve train. What is a valve train? It's a mechanical system that controls the operation of the intake and exhaust valves, and that allows us to get air into the chamber and exhaust gases out. Now, SOHC, single overhead cam. So the camshaft is above the valves, and there is one camshaft per bank of cylinders. So if we come over here, here's the timing cover. I don't know if you can see here. Yeah, there's a timing cover. There's one camshaft here, well, one cam sprocket, and there's a camshaft going along here which controls the valves here for the front bank here. And on the back here, same again, one camshaft going along, controlling the valves, rocker arms, and all that good stuff. If you have a DOHC, then you have 2 per bank, so you have 4 in total. That's what that is. VTEC, it's a Honda specific technology and trademark. It stands for Variable Valve Timing and Lift Electronic Control. So it just gives you high performance at high RPM and lower fuel consumption at low RPM. I have a video on VTEC, I'll link it in the description below. And the last thing on this engine, it's a V6, so 6 cylinders, 6 coils, 6 spark plugs, so 3 at the front here, 3 at the back here, and in each cylinder we have 4 valves, so 2 intake valves, 2 exhaust valves, 2 intake valves all the way along, so that's 24 valves total in this engine. We're going to be adjusting all 24 valves, so that's 12 intake, 12 exhaust, and that's what we're doing. As before, camshaft comes in, there's cam lobes attached to the camshaft, they control rocker arms and they adjust the valves. So it's the distance between the rocker arm and the valve, and that's what we're adjusting now. So on the Honda J series engine, you might have heard this, but I'll repeat it now. It's a common problem that exhaust valves are tight and get tight over time. So that is the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve. And it's smaller than designed. This means exhaust valves, when they come in the combustion chamber, they open early while the piston is still coming down during the power stroke. During the power stroke, the piston is still creating vacuum, so this vacuum is lost earlier than expected. And when the clearance is tight, the valve opens earlier and further. This can easily cause engine misfires for that cylinders and many other symptoms too. So in addition to exhaust valves getting tight over time, the clearance getting tight, the intake valves sometimes tend to get loose as well on this same engine. So while we're in the area, we're going to adjust the intake valves and the exhaust valves together. So symptoms, like how do I know my valves need adjusting? Number one, routine maintenance. You've cleared 100,000 miles, you haven't adjusted or checked your valves, it's a good time to do so. Number two, engine misfires. Maybe you've got a check engine light, you plugged in your OBD2 tool, scans the engine, you've got a generic misfire code, say a P0300, accompanying that with cylinder numbers. Maybe you have a cylinder misfire on 2, 3, and 4, and you're like, oh, why all my cylinders got misfires? It could be a sign of a valve adjustment. Maybe your vehicle's hard starting, you have a rough idle, especially before the car's warmed up, which indicates late valve opening, choking off fuel. Loud rattling noise, so valves knocking against the side of the shaft, engine overheating, misfiring, which I've just covered, fuel trims, long-term, short-term fuel trims out of tolerance, assuming the O2 sensors are behaving correctly. Now, since some of these symptoms often disappear when the car warms up, they're easy to ignore, so we're going to tackle this today. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is you can get an exact diagnosis on this issue, but it involves some specialist equipment such as a pressure transducer and specialist graphing software as well. It's quite hard to do, but if you've ruled out ignition, fuel and everything else, and you just like, where are these misfires coming from, then it's a good time to check the valves and the valve clearance. So let's get started. Park your car, get it in a nice position, turn your wheel all the way to the right, we'll see in a second, and pop the hood. So here's some of the tools you need. For all the tools here, I've linked them in the description below so you can check those out and get the exact same ones, and this goes for parts as well. Number one thing, you need an offset feeler gauge here. Offset meaning it bends around here. If you have something like a spark plug feeler gauge, it just won't really do because we need to sort of get down and in. We don't want these to get catching and giving us false readings. So that's why we use an offset gauge here. Just some basic socket extensions. We need a 19mm socket, and that will allow us to rotate the crank and set the piston positions. We need a 10mm wrench and a flathead to adjust the valves. You can get a valve adjustment tool as well. It's the same thing but combined together. An Allen key to get the coils off. Here we have our seals here for our valve covers. Now we have the one for bank 1 and bank 2, and we have spark plug seals and bolt seals as well. A generic bag of sockets to get all the upper intake and duct work off. And I've got a hammer and some pliers. It's really tricky to get the old spark plug seals out and things, so it's good to use a flathead, knock those out, or maybe some pliers just to rip them out. And the last thing I have is just a drill with a couple of steel head tools here. That allows me to get all the paint there that's sort of chipped off the covers. So that's optional really, but that's just for my benefit there. So not really much you need at all. Let's get going. We need to be able to rotate the crank, so that'll be the 19mm crank bolt, and that's just behind this little panel here. So we're just going to remove these toggles with a flathead or some needle nose pliers and just pull this panel off right here. Depending on the car, you might have an access port around here where you can just poke the wrench through. Looks a bit like that, where we can rotate the crank without removing this. So with these, just pull the middle piece out first. Use a flathead or a special tool, it doesn't really matter. And then once the center piece is out, this one will pull out rather easily the same way. If you all pull it out together, you risk breaking the back ends of this piece here. And when rotating the crank, there's no need to put the car on jack stands. You can just turn the wheel all the way to the right and we can access it through the front there. Number one, if your car's warm, let it cool. We're going to be adjusting these valves on a cold engine. Cold meaning less than 38 degrees centigrade or 100 degrees Fahrenheit as per the service manual. So when you're getting your car into position, don't waste a lot of time driving around, let it cool down. Cold engine. Number two, we're going to remove this ductwork here. So we've got a flathead right there, we have a 10mm bolt here, and we have a flathead here. Just this outer one here, we're going to leave this one. So bolt out, flathead loose, just push this way. There's a little bung behind here, it will just pop out of its socket there. Now with this, just lift it up in the air like this, and it should just pop out forwards. Very easy. Next, the airbox assembly. And depending on the car, you might have these in different positions. It could be over here, but engine the same. So Saturn Vue, for those purposes, remove the top, filter, and 10mm bolt right there. So bolt removed. We're going to remove the map sensor. That's how our ECU knows how much metered air we're getting into the engine. Here it's just stuck on by this ductwork. You can sort of twist and pull and it'll come right out. And just set that to one side. Now the reason we removed the airbox assembly is so we can just easily check this little inspection port here. It's quite hard to see with the airbox there. So we just remove this here, and on this cam sprocket here has numbers for all 6 cylinders, and that will tell us which piston here is at top dead center. More on that later, but that's why we removed it. While we're in the area, you can inspect your motor mounts. If you're not sure what they are, how they work, I'll link it in the description below. So the next step is to get access to the valves here. Now these are the valve covers here. There's the rear one right there, and the front one kind of under here. You can see there's a little oil residue here, which is a sign the gasket might be failing at the back. More on that later. So what we need to do is to take off this upper intake here, this whole piece here. We don't really need to remove it, but we can't access the bolts on the valve covers otherwise, so this needs to come off. So to do this, we need to remove the top cover. These are all 10mm bolts here, all the way along, and take off the top cover from the upper intake. When removing bolts from anything to do with the intake or really large service areas in general, it's good to remove them from the outside in. So outside, outside, then the inside ones. When tightening, it's the reverse. Bolts removed. Top cover comes off. Now the gasket here, it can be reused. They're made of metal. However, give it an inspection, make sure there's no breaks or anything like that. You might want to clean the crud off here as well, so it gives a nice seal afterwards. But for the most part, it can stay with this upper intake. The next thing we're going to do is remove all these bolts here. They are 12mm. And with these bolts, like the cover, go from outside in to remove, and that includes the nuts as well. But you don't need to remove these two on the end here. So now all the bolts have been removed and the 2 nuts, just inspect the EGR passages. So these little holes here, make sure they're not really blocked or partially blocked. The idea of EGR, if you're not familiar, it recirculates exhaust gases to remove harmful NOx emissions. It will throw a code if they are fully blocked, in the 400s I believe, but it's good to check while this is apart. So now the upper intake is loose here. We just need to separate all the hoses and everything to pull this out of the vehicle. So maybe Saturn Vue specific here is a 10mm bolt. It just bolts this ductwork mounting bracket to the AC line here. So we're just going to remove this 10mm bolt here. Next, this hose here, it doesn't really matter which side you take it from, it's either going to come out with the valve cover or the upper intake. So I'm just going to disconnect this one here. You just use some needle nose pliers, pinch, pull, and pull it off there, easy. There we go. Next at the back, I believe this one's the brake booster here. Pinch, pull back and pull off. Now coming around the side here, we're going to remove the throttle body with the intake. We're going to take it all out together. The problem is if you remove the throttle body, you could damage the gasket here, so you may need a new gasket, but we can just take it all off in one piece and not have to worry about that. That is, unless you have a gasket leak. So what we're going to do, we're going to disconnect these 2 harnesses here and right here as well. Next we're going to disconnect here. You can just stick a flathead here and twist, and that'll allow it to pull itself off this bracket here if it's not too rusted on. Just like that. Next we're going to separate this part here from the throttle body, so just use your flathead on the second little zip tie clamp here and loosen this and just pull it off. So it just swings out the way. Be wary of these if it's quite an old vehicle. We don't want to snap or dislodge anything, so pull it off slowly and it can just rest here. Before we get a bit more serious with these electrical connections, let's remove the negative terminal off the battery. We don't want to cause any shorts of any kind. So coming down here, we're just going to remove this electrical connector here. Now our negative terminal is off. Just push down on the yellow piece here. It might just snap and then go, and it will rotate all the way around till it's facing upwards, and then it will just pop off. Just like that. We can just push that out of the way. Coming underneath the throttle body, 2 clips right here. So if any of these hoses are hard to get off, just get a small screwdriver and just slowly sneak it down the sides. Don't go crazy, we don't want to break the hose. A lot of the time, just with continued heat, they'll just sort of seize on a little bit, but eventually you'll manage to shake it loose. Don't tug on it too hard because you will run the risk of ripping them or tearing them. So both those coolant lines are removed now. Just coming around here, we're just going to remove this bottom one just under there, and also this little electrical harness on top of here, and that should fully disconnect the upper intake on this engine. So we've removed the line there and the harness, and this upper intake should be safe to lift and remove. Double check all the way around if your configuration is slightly different, and then we're just going to lift the upper intake out of the vehicle. So now the upper intake is fully removed, we can get access to these bolts I was talking about earlier on the valve cover. Otherwise we just cannot access them. Always when removing an upper intake, cover these ports. Definitely number one thing to do immediately. We don't want anything falling into here. So use some painter's tape or a towel or even both. So something like that, perfect. We just don't want anything to go in there. The tubes kind of go up and over there, so you're just never going to get it back out again, especially if it's not magnetic. So better safe than sorry. So while the upper intake's out, we can use some throttle body cleaner in there, clean out the throttle body. We can also clean up any gunk you have in here. Carb cleaner works well for that. Up to you, totally optional. So we can see in here, here's a sign that some of our gaskets have failed here. Here's a bolt gasket here. You see it's slowly leaking oil. You can see there's oil residue here from a leak that could be either the seal or maybe this bolt has, drifted along a bit. So it's actually good we bought a gasket set for this so we can replace that when we're taking these valve covers off. And with this job, you don't necessarily need to replace the gaskets, but the thing is now everything's a part. For such a cheap part, $10–15, we might as well replace them. It's a good time to do this. So what we want to do now is swing these electrical harnesses out of the way. So the rear one up over there, the front one up here. So 10mm bolt here and here. Now we're taking a lot of bolts off. It's good to label them, if you're not familiar or it's your first time doing so. So next we're going to disconnect the coil packs. We're not going to remove the coils themselves out yet, just because we might send some debris down there and we haven't finished taking off this stuff yet. So we're going to remove the coil packs at the last minute. But for now we're going to remove the electrical harnesses just by pressing the side tab and disconnecting them. So 3 at the front and 3 at the rear. Next, one thing to get out of the way before we forget is the oil dipstick. Last thing we want to do is snap that off. So let's remove that and put that out of the way now. So the idea here is we just want to swing these, this whole harness assembly out of the way. So we just need to loosen anything on the sides that's preventing this from rising and moving. So you can see on the side here, the harness here is clipped in with this little green tie here. You can pinch the back of these with some pliers and just pop it out. So just like that, it just separates it from the timing cover there and gives us a bit more lift. So coming over here by where the oil dipstick lives, there's a little navy blue harness. Now we saw this with the throttle body assembly. It's just the case of there's a little tab here, and you actually lift it up. You don't push it to the left, so you lift it up, and when you do that, it'll come off the bracket and just slide off, just like that. and that way you don't snap it, and then that gives us a bit more height on our electrical harness. And on the right side at the front here, you have a couple harnesses just strapped in on this bracket here. You can just disconnect those in the same way. I believe I have enough height to sort of slide the cover out and put it in, so I'll probably stop there, but you can go ahead and, you know, endlessly disconnect these. That's the principle really. We just want a room to get the valve cover out, that is all. And again, same with the rear here. So coming to the rear harness now, there's a couple bolts holding in this harness here. You can see with our little mirror here, there's one right there, a little rusted one, and one just over here. You can see it's rounded, so that's going to be a problem for me. I hope yours are in better condition in that instance. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to clip away at this with some pliers, or try and get some pliers to get this out, which is quite difficult because these little plastic triangles are in the way, but you know, you always run into problems, you have to account for them. So this bolt, and we're going to remove this bolt behind here. Again, both 10mm. So I managed to get the 10mm bolt out. What I did, I used a 3/8 inch socket, which is the tiniest bit smaller than 10mm, and that accounted for our corrosion here, and we managed to pull it out. I just used a flat head to get rid of the rust and pulled that out. Now the rear harness bolts, if you don't have a replacement anyway, exactly the same as the front ones. One's slightly longer, one's slightly smaller, so you can just exchange that, and that way your bad one's on the front now, not in the rear, hard to get to. So when you go to a salvage yard, you can just pull one off and replace it. Again, up to you, but just a little tip there. So coming around the rear here, front of the engine, we've got one of these navy clips again. We know what to do with those. Just pull that off the bracket. And this is snaking around the timing cover trim here, so we can just pop that out. It's just pressed into place. That'll give us a bit more lift. Coming on the right side of the rear here, there's a green one right there, right in the middle of the video here. It works just like the navy ones. I don't know why it's green. Maybe they ran out of blue, I'm not sure. But yeah, just pull it out and pull that off the bracket there. And the last thing I'm going to do here is just disconnect these fuel injectors on the rear here, just so we can sort of remove this, and this is how we're going to get our valve cover out here. So it's just a case of 3 connectors there, and just squeeze them in and pull them out, and then from here you can just pop this out. I think there's a little thing you just pinch with pliers, which might be hard to do, but I think you can wiggle these out rather easily and it'll just pop out of the bracket there. So on the right side of the rear valve cover, we're just going to pinch this clip and pull the hose off there. Then we're going to start removing these bolts here. So now it's time to remove the valve cover bolts. There's 5 bolts on each valve cover here. On the back there's one here, one on each side, and 2 at the back, one here and one here. It's 10mm, same for the front as well. If they're oily or, you know, rounded or rusty, just make sure you get a really snug fit on there, and use the 3/8 inch trick I mentioned earlier if that doesn't work. They'll be really hard to drill out, not impossible, but yeah, you really don't want to round these ones off. So now all the bolts are loose, the front rear and the rear front can be removed. The others will just set in their place and they'll come off with the cover when we remove it. So now we've stopped flinging oil and dust particles everywhere, we can now take the coils out. So it's a number 6 Allen wrench, 6mm. It's the case of putting it in the Allen bolt right there for each coil and undoing it, taking the bolt out, pulling the coil out. 3 at the front and 3 at the rear. So we've removed all 6 coils now on the V6 engine and all the bolts that hold those down. Inspect the coils, check for signs of arcing or, you know, catastrophic failure. This is what a used coil should look like. So now the next thing is to do with the spark plugs. Question: do you need to remove the spark plugs to do a valve adjustment? Short answer: no, you don't. Long answer: no, but. And the but is, if you're doing the valve adjustment as a maintenance measure and your plugs aren't due for a change out that soon, you know, maybe you did them a couple months ago or something like that, then your plugs are probably fine, you can leave them in there. However, if you're doing this because of a misfire or, you know, something's gone quite wrong, the symptoms we talked about of needing a valve adjustment, then it's a really good idea to take your plugs out and have a look at them, because when things misfire, you know, your plugs are getting fouled and you just don't know what they look like. So this is a perfect opportunity to take them out and have a look. As far as the valve adjustment goes itself, we can position a piston to top dead center with the plugs in. It just takes more effort because on the compression stroke, you know, we're compressing air with our hand by rotating the crank. The air can't just escape out the spark plug hole, so it'll be a little bit more effort on our arms to get that piston to top dead center. So there you go. Now you know the information. It's up to you what you want to do with that. If you're removing your plugs, I'll show you a diagram now on how to identify fouled plugs and what working plugs should look like. So now it's time to remove the valve covers. Front valve cover and rear valve cover, we're just going to pull them both out. So just move the harness out of the way as best you can and slide out the valve covers. If it won't budge using fingers, just get a really wide flathead screwdriver and just pry up on here. Be careful of the pressurized fuel rail here, you don't want fuel going everywhere. If you feel you need a bit more room to get at the rear valve cover here, you can do a couple more things. First, you can remove this bolt here, the very rusty looking one, and that will disconnect just this like ground cable here that's coming out of the harness and give you a little bit more room. And down here you can remove these covers here. It's just a case of sticking a flathead screwdriver down here, twisting, and then they pull up just like this, and that will give you access to the cable all the way along. But you will need to unplug this harness and potentially also the fuel injectors on the front side then, and that way you have all the play you need with regards to valve adjusting on this engine. So you can see here now we've removed that here. I'll just put the bolt back in there so you can see. We don't really need to touch these fuel injector harnesses here, because once this comes out here, there's so much height that I don't think you're going to have a problem with the rear side there. So I have both valve covers off the car now, so you can see the condition of them. You know, I believe there's a slight oil leak on the gasket here. This one, it's just, you know, it's an old engine. So that's why we use the drill here. Well, I'm going to anyway, and that will just clean up a lot of the paint off them, make it nice, so when we put it back in, we're not getting paint drop into our valves, which probably won't be that good. Underneath it, you see the gasket going around the outside. We'll be replacing this, and also the spark plug well gaskets here, we'll be replacing those, and also the gaskets on the bolts, which you can see here, these will be replacing those as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clean these up and then get them ready and prepped for reinstalling. So now the valve cover's off here, it gives you a good window into how well this car has been maintained with regards to oil changing and general maintenance. Now this has over 200,000 miles on it, and it looks pretty good for its age. There's no, you know, there's not much oil clotting or things like that. It looks generally okay for its age. Now, I alluded to at the start of the video about VTEC and what VTEC is. I'll link it in the description below. You can learn all about VTEC and how it works, but it's just a different cam profile here. So at low RPM, you get good fuel economy, and these two rocker arms here are used to move the valves up and down. And when VTEC is activated here, the locking pin comes in and these all move together on this cam profile here, which is, you know, a little bit thicker than these two, and they all move together, which makes the valves go deeper and for a longer period of time to get more air into the combustion chamber and give the car a performance boost at high RPM. So if you want to learn about VTEC, I'll link it in the description below. Let's get on with adjusting these valves. So I'll just do a really brief thing on how this all works. The camshaft rotates here, the camshaft runs along the middle here. Now the camshaft has cam lobes on it here, and again these rotate and give a cam profile which moves the rocker arms, which are these guys here. Now the rocker arms here sit on top of these valves here, which go into the combustion chamber and allow us to open and close our valves. So on the intake side up here towards the intake, we know it's the intake one because Honda actually labels the bolts here, which is nice of them, and also because it's closer to the intake. The exhaust valves are on the outside here. Similarly for the rear one here, exhaust over there, intake closest to the intake. So that's how you know where they are. Now we have two intake valves here and two exhaust valves down there. So that's 4 per cylinder. This is cylinder number 6, 5, 4, and you can see the exact same configuration. And what we're going to be doing now is adjusting the valve lash, which is the space between the rocker arm here and the valve which goes into the combustion chamber. So this is what it looks like when you get the valve cover off. So when adjusting these valves, it's very, very important to know this cylinder order numbering. Actually, it's imperative. So over here we have cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's important when we turn the engine over. So when adjusting the valves, the one we're working on currently and adjusting the valves for, intake and exhaust side, we need to put that piston at top dead center, and we do that by rotating the crankshaft down there. Just because cylinder number 6 here is the easiest to get to, I'm going to use this one for the purpose of the video. You will repeat the steps on all the cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to do cylinder number 6, so let's run through a full example on how to adjust the valves on cylinder number 6. So as mentioned before, the way we work out which cylinder is at top dead center is to look through our inspection port here for the cam sprocket. So you can see here, cylinder number 4 is currently at top dead center. You can see the little plastic toggle there at the bottom of the inspection port and the little line on the cam sprocket with the number 4 above. That tells us number 4 is ready for valve adjusting. But as in our example, we're going to start with valve number 6. We need to rotate the crankshaft to get number 6 at top dead center so we can adjust the valves on that cylinder. So to rotate the cam sprocket, we're going to rotate the crankshaft. As the drive belt's on, they're all connected. So we're coming in through the passenger side here, behind the wheel, move the cover down, and we're going to put a 19mm socket on this crankshaft bolt here and rotate the engine over clockwise. Now this engine rotates clockwise, so always go this direction. If you move backwards, which you can do, the problem is behind this timing cover you have a timing tensioner and it can cause the timing belt to jump teeth when it's moving backwards, so always go clockwise. If you accidentally jump your mark, so you're aiming for number 6 and it's a notch over, go all the way around again clockwise. So we're just going to rotate the engine over clockwise until our mark lines up with the cylinder we want to adjust. Now again, if you leave your spark plugs in, this will be a lot tougher. If you just turn this with your arms here and peek your head over, you can see it moving as you turn it, and that way you don't miss out. The numbers will rotate in the firing order of the engine, so 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6. So if you're going for number 6, you know it comes after number 3, so you can start slowing down then. If you did leave your spark plugs in, you can always loosen them all to have an easier time with this. What happens, you get near the notch and it will just hop over, so if you're getting a bit frustrated with that, you don't have to take them out, just loosen them, it's no problem at all. So we have our number 6 lined up now. Let's adjust the valves. So let's take our offset feeler gauge here and start adjusting the valves. Now the valve clearance specification for this engine, right here, it's a little bit dirty. So the intake valves, let's do these first. So the top line here. So here it is here in metric, and here it is in imperial. Now my offset feeler gauge has metric and imperial, so whichever one you feel comfortable. Let's work with the inches here. So 0.008 to 0.009. So we're going to get a feeler gauge for this one and also one for this one, and I'll show you why. So we have these two gauges set out. That's the lower end of the spec and that's the higher end of the spec. As the intake valves on this engine tend to get looser, we're going to first start testing with the 0.009 on the intake side. So with our 0.009, this is the upper end of the spec. This is where you insert the feeler gauge, right here. So just above the valve, below the arm here. And just check to see how loose it is. I can actually twist this side to side, which is an indication it has loosened up quite a lot. Try and get a straight sort of push into it, so you're not like catching it diagonally, which is really hard to do. So just move it around and just confirm how loose it is here. This one, it seems quite loose, so it might need tightening, just just a net. So once we've identified a valve that needs adjusting, so in this case this one needs to be tightened up a bit, what we do, we just crack the bolt. If you can't crack it, use a socket wrench just to crack it, and then use this tool so you can actually see what's going on. Before you move anything, note the orientation here. You can see this one is like 9, 3 o'clock. Remember that, because then you know how much you're adjusting it by. Again, with these, we make very minor adjustments. So from 9 to 3 o'clock, maybe we want to put it on, say, 10, 4 o'clock, something like that. Once we've done that, we're going to tighten this with the wrench. Keep both hands on tools at the same time, because when you snug this up, they tend to move together. I'm just showing you for the camera because I only have one hand here. So we're going to test with 10 to 4 here. We're going to snug this up, and then we're going to check again with the feeler gauges. Alternatively, you can use a valve adjustment tool, which is the wrench and flathead combined into one tool. With that tool, it's hard to see how much you're moving it while you're doing it, so that's why I like using the wrench and the screwdriver, so you can easily see how much you're rotating while you're doing it. So we're going to take our 0.009 and just test again to see if we can get the feeler gauge in here. So it's good to use two hands here. Here we go. So you can see, so this is the upper end of the spec, the looser end, and we can still drag it back and forth. So we're gonna try, say, 11.5 next. Just make it a little tighter. So I've put it in I suppose a 11:30, 4:30 position here. I'm trying with the looser end of the spec, and yeah, it's too tight. I can't even get the looser one in. So in this instance, we're going to try the 0.008 now, which is the tighter end of the spec. So here's the 0.008, and again, that is still that is still too tight. So we're going to have to actually back this off now and make the gap a little larger. So we've just backed it off a bit. Here's the 0.008. There's a little bit of drag, maybe a tiny bit too much than I'd like, so I might just back it off just a gnat. So I've just backed it off the tiniest bit, and the 0.008, there's a little bit of drag, but it seems okay. Now this is the lower end of the spec. Remember, 0.008 to 0.009 on these, on the intake side. And as intake on this particular engine tend to, the valve lash kind of opens up, that's a common problem, then we'll plan for that. So we'll put it at the lower end of the spec. And when I say spec, make sure it is within the spec itself. Don't put it at 0.006, because that's not in the spec. So if you're unsure, put it on the lower end of the spec on the intake side, and as exhaust valves tighten, then on that one we'll plan for them to get tight, so we put those on the looser end of the spec. So that's how we do it on this engine. So with this 0.008 seems pretty good. Let's just try the 0.009. So the 0.009, it's not really going in at all, but the 0.008 moves with the correct amount of drag. So I think I might leave this one. I think it's pretty good. If you want to go further, try the 0.007 as well, just to make sure it's really accurate. Again, with these, they're all really minor adjustments, so you're really only moving this screw the tiniest bit. You're not doing full 360s or even 180s or anything like that. So just use the feeler gauge to your advantage. You know the specs, 0.008, 0.009, use the 7, use the 10, just to make sure these are accurate. You've put all this time in to take this off. It's good to make sure these are accurate. I'm happy with this one. Let's move on to the second intake valve for this cylinder. So based on the last one, I went all in with the 10, so that's outside of the spec. I'm just assuming it'll be loose like the other one. I mean, there's no guarantees, it might not be. But the 10 moves back and forth with relative ease, so this is out of the spec, way looser than the spec, so we know we need to adjust this one without even testing the 8 and the 9. So when testing the second intake valve on here, it was similarly loose to this one, and because we remembered the orientation, it was roughly 9 to 3, and we knew we rotated it this many degrees, then if the other one feels similarly loose, that can be our first measurement to try. So note the orientation, move it by how much we adjusted this one, and then we can test with our feeler gauges. So just a little tip there. So the second intake valve, this cylinder, I've adjusted it to almost the 9.3 position. It was a bit different before. I'm using the lower end of the spec here and it slides through quite nicely. It feels like the other one too. I'm still going to test the 9, I'm still going to test the 7 just to confirm. It's important we get these right. So I'm pretty satisfied these are within spec now. I put them on 0.008 of the spec. Intake is done on cylinder number 6. We're now going to move on to the exhaust valves, which are down here, and that's these two right there. So now both intake valves are done for cylinder 6. We're going to do the exhaust valves. So there's the metric and imperial measurement. So with our offset feeler gauges, we're going to go in with 0.11 and 0.013. So these will be tight, at least I assume they will be, because it's a common problem. So I'm just going to go in with 0.11, the tighter end of the spec, and check the lash on that. So here's the tighter one. So this should fit in no problem, and it seems they are very, very tight. So I'll see what I can get in there, then it will give you an indication of how tight they could be. And I can just get 0.007 in, so they are really tight. Yeah, absolutely crazy. I can't get 0.008 in there at all. So again, just like the intake, we're going to adjust them in the exact same way. Note the orientation, so that looks like 9 to 3-ish, and we're going to loosen those, so we're going to go left this time. Maybe start with 12.6 if it's at 9.3, and we're going to check again. So exactly the same principle. And with the exhaust valves, as they tend to get tightened, we want to plan for that, so we want to put them on the looser end of the spec, which is on here, 0.013. So that's sort of what we're aiming for. So I put it in the 12.6 position. I can get the 10 in, but I can't get the 11 in. It's not sitting very good, so I'm going to have to back it off even more. So we're going to try maybe 10 o'clock, 4 o'clock position and loosen it even more. Again, we want the 0.013 to go in here with a little bit of drag. Okay, so that's what we're settling with there. So yeah, a little bit more. The 0.13 has a bit of drag, and yeah, it's at the higher end of the spec on the exhaust side. So yeah, again, these will be tight, almost guaranteed if you haven't done it before and the car has some significant age on it. So we're just going to repeat for the second exhaust valve on number 6 cylinder now. So the second exhaust valve on cylinder 6, equally tight really. I backed it off by almost as much as the other one. With the exhaust valves at the very front, it's really hard to get the feeler gauge in and, you know, to check for clearance. So just be patient with it and keep moving it back and forth till you get the correct lash. Sometimes you think it's going in, but it's just the angle. So you do really have to be wary of the angle it's going in at. But as long as you test with the surrounding gauges and you're confident your measurements are correct, then move on to the next one. So I briefly mentioned before, but you can see these bolts here. It says IN for intake and X for exhaust, so there's no real way to get confused about the you know, which side the valve's on. So I thought that was a pretty cool addition that Honda made here. So now cylinder number 6 is completed on the intake side and the exhaust side. We're going to repeat the whole process 5 more times now, because we're going to do all 6 cylinders. So again, rotate the crankshaft, choose your next cylinder. Ordering really doesn't matter. We're going to go to the next cylinder and repeat until all 6 are done. So once you've adjusted all 4 valves, both intake, both exhaust on each cylinder, 24 valves total. A lot of people would have you repeat the whole process again to double check. That is up to you. As long as you know you did a good job checking the lash on all of them, you are good to go. Let's talk about the gaskets on the valve covers and replacing all those gaskets there for reassembly. So I've cleaned up the valve covers a bit. I got it off with a steel drill bit there, and I used some brake spark cleaner just to really get it up there. So there's no loose paint on here, there's no oil residue or anything like that. It is somewhat important to get all the oil residue off at least, because if your gasket didn't seal correctly, we can easily spot the oil leak, and we're not looking within old caked oil to work out if it's re-leaking. So tip there. So now we're going to look at the gaskets here and how to replace those. So underneath here, it's just a case of pulling out the old gasket. There'll be a little tab here, so you can just grab that and pull it all the way out, and that will remove the gasket. If you're not replacing the gasket, then just double check they're nice and, you know, spongy and they're not cracking or anything. But I do really recommend replacing them, you know, before you go in. The last thing you want to do is take it all apart and you don't have the gasket if you do need it. So this, very easy. Remove the old one and make sure all the debris is out of here, so leftover gasket or anything like that, before we press in our new gasket. But before we put in this new gasket, we're going to tap out these spark plug well gaskets here. And I do that, I say that in that order because when we tap these out, we don't want to ruin the new gasket by sitting this up on a bench or the ground or anything like that. Because to get these out, we're going to be sticking a flat head here and just tapping them out. So we don't want to, you know, graze our new gasket. So that's why we're not putting it in right now. So let's tap these out. So flat head here, just put it between the gasket and the valve cover there. Obviously hold it with your hand. And just tap it with a hammer, and that'll push the gasket out of the hole. It's a lot easier to get them back in. So there we go, that's what we're going for. Just compromise it and then it will slot out pretty easily. When putting the new one back in, don't put it that way. Make sure it goes that way, so hole at the bottom. And when we press it in, it's really easy to do. So when pressing, you can just use your thumb all the way around. You can use a rubber mallet, it's up to you. But if you do them one at a time, you can compare how far they actually go in here, so you know it's all the way in. So now the first one's done, repeat for the other 5 of them. So now these gaskets are in and level, we're just going to put the outer seal in, the outer gasket for the valve cover. And it's just a case of pressing it in with this tab at the top and not at the bottom. So one done. And the second one is all done. A little tip that I just remembered for these spark plug gaskets: if you're not sure whether they're in or you can't get them in, just find a socket roughly the same size here. See, that one's pretty good, and just lightly tap with a hammer and that'll make sure it'll go in evenly. So just a little tip there. So now let's move on to our bolts here, the bolt gaskets. So what we need to do, we just need to pop this gasket off the bolt there, off the bottom. You can see there's a little metal discus of some sort in the way, so we just need to push this off. Easiest way to do that is to get a socket, put it in here, and then we're going to tap the top of the socket with a hammer and put that on a towel so we don't damage the bottom threads. I'm just going to bash that with a hammer. That'll slide right off. Another thing you can do if you don't have a socket or you don't want to do that for whatever reason, get some snippy pliers like these and just snip the side of it. You can separate the rubber and the metal like this. So you just get a screwdriver, separate it or pull it apart, and then you're only snipping this piece. This bit is wider than the disc, so it'll slip right off. So the thing we need to compromise is this part here. So we're going to do this for all of the bolts and get all of the gasket washers off there. Your kit will contain exactly 10 of these for the 10 bolts, but I recommend doing them one at a time, because if you accidentally split a new one when putting it on, you know, you don't really want to go to the store or anything like that. You might as well just choose your best one till last, and maybe just leave it on and not do that one. So again, choice is yours. I recommend doing them one at a time just for that reason. If you have any rusted bolts, you know, throughout the whole process of doing this, you can just get the rust off if you don't have any replacements, and that way you're not going to run into any difficulties when tightening, or maybe if you want to get back in here again. So getting the new gaskets back on here is pretty much the opposite, and again the socket really helps here. So just position it like this, and then we're going to get our socket here and we're just going to press it on. So just position it on like this, and rather than pushing straight down, which can actually crack it and ruin it, just go side to side really steadily like this. Really hard to do with one hand, and then it will just push on. And voila, 9 more to go. So we went from that to that, and now we're ready to put the covers back on the car. So we're about to put the valve covers back on now, front and back. We just want to clean this gasket mating area because there's a rough surface here, so use maybe like a plastic scraper or some sort of carb cleaner on a rag and, you know, really rub it and make sure it's nice and smooth. That's the main point here. The last thing we want is not getting a perfect seal, so very important. So all 24 valves now checked. All the exhaust valves were tight, really tight, way out of spec. The intake valves were a little off, but they were all loose, so everything has been adjusted. It might be the case where you only do the exhaust intakes are fine, but there we go, all done. Let's get this back together. So getting the valve covers in, the rear one probably the most tricky, because what tends to happen is as you put it in, this gasket can slip and then cause an oil leak, and then you're gonna have to open it all the way back up again. So I recommend bungee cables just to move this as high and out the way as possible for number one. Number two, just get a little bit of oil from here and just coat the spark plug gaskets. That way when we seat it on, it's not going to get wrapped up on those, and it's not going to cause a problem with those leaking either. So these three lubed up nicely, and then we're going to try and put it on as level as we can without the gasket slipping. Okay, it's in. When putting it in, put a finger in the fast spark plug holes as you drop it in, and then you can feel for the spark plug well and help guide it in the gasket a lot better. That way these gaskets don't slip either. So that's how you do it. Just line this up with the holes and then just gently press it down, and then you'll get a nice seal. What we can do next is get an inspection mirror and just make sure the gasket hasn't slipped at the back where we can't see. So for me it looks okay. I've already looked it over, but just for your sake so you can see what's going on. So gasket looks good. We're going to bolt this valve cover down now. So the bolts here, 8.7 foot-pounds of torque. Remember the smaller bolt goes in the front on the rear cover here. And with this we're going to start with the inside one, so I guess this one and the back two, and then do the outside ones last. Alright, rear valve cover on. Now we're going to do the front valve cover. Exactly the same technique as the rear. So we're going to start putting things back now. Oil fill cap, close the inspection port, make sure your wrench is off the crankshaft. You don't really want to be driving with that still attached. And then we're going to put these harnesses back together. But before the harnesses, we'll put the spark plug coils back in so we don't have any gaping holes for any debris to fall into. So let's put all 6 coils back. So all the coils are in now, bolted down. Don't go crazy, it's plastic. So we're just going to put this blue connector back in. That is if you removed that one. So it just goes in there. And then we're going to tuck this cable back in here and put our little plastic caps back on. Okay, next let's put this ground little clamp back in there and bolt that on, and then we're going to put our fuel injector harnesses back on. If you got these a bit mixed up, the longest one is over here, that's the middle, and then your third one's here. So plug that back in and put it back in the harness. Next, let's bolt down the rear and the front electrical harness. So if you remember, that's that bolt there, the awkward one, and the one at the back there. Same with the front each side. Okay, so the rear harness is bolt down, so is the front one with these two. Remember, put your crappy bolts in an easy to access place in case you want to change them easily later. Next, oil dipstick. So now we're finished playing in here, we're in no danger of snapping it off accidentally. And now the next one we're going to do is the valve cover tube here. We're just going to put it back on. So valve cover tube back in there. Now we're going to put these clasps back in. There's a green one here, just slides on the bracket, and our blue one here goes on this bracket. And exactly the same on the front with this bracket here and the one over here. Right there. And then we're just going to push this green one back in there, and we're going to tuck this cable here back in the timing cover where it came from before. Next, we're going to connect our coils back up to the electrical harness. Now the harness is in, so all 6 of those. So everything looks connected. Go around everything, just double check your work to make sure everything is reconnected. What I like to do, get a leaf blower, just blow it all out. It's the perfect opportunity before we put the upper intake back on. So we're ready for our upper intake now. We're going to peel away the painter's tape, just clean the gasket as best as possible, get all the inconsistencies off. Then we're going to drop our upper intake back on. So before we start reattaching all the hoses and everything, we're going to bolt down the upper intake manifold. We're going to do a 2-pass tightening process, which means we're going to do it twice. So the first pass, we're going to tighten all the bolts inside out, so all the inside ones, then slowly move out to 97 inch-pounds. Once you've done that, we're going to do it again to 16 foot-pounds, and that means the intake manifold will be in. If you're going to torque anything down during this project, I recommend these bolts are the ones to do. So now that's bolted down, we might as well put the top cover back on. It's a similar process. Don't forget the gasket here. You can't mix it up, it only goes on one way. Make sure the gasket is clear of debris, as is the top cover as well. We want a good seal. It's a metal gasket, we can reuse it, no problems. So just like the intake manifold, start from the inside out. The first pass, we're going to do 4.4 foot-pounds, and then the second pass 8.8 foot-pounds, and that will get the top cover back on the intake manifold. So let's start putting some hoses and things back. So we got the one right here, so don't forget that. We have the bracket here that bolts the air duct bracket to the AC line here. Now we're going to put these two coolant lines back, so this one and this one. Now we're just going to push this back onto the throttle body there. And once that's done, we're going to tighten the flathead down so it's nice and secure. Put the electrical harnesses back on, so we'll pop this back on the bracket. Get this one back on here, and also on there. Next we're going to do the electrical harness. That's the big harness we removed back here with the locking mechanism. Just going to slot that back on here. And don't forget the beige locking thing to lock it once it's back in place. And coming up behind here, another electrical harness just sits in the top there. And brake booster, you got boost power, name the video game. And that goes back on there, and we'll use our pliers to crimp that back up. And underneath here we have a little hose as well, almost forgot that one. So now I believe everything is connected. If you make a rough diagram, it'll help you put things back together. The same way we collected bolts in piles, just a little tip there. So now everything's back on. If you lost any coolant when the coolant lines came off, remember to top that back up on the overflow over there. And then we're going to start putting the airbox back in. So airbox assembly back in, put the bungs in first, and then the pipe, and then it will just fall on in. Very easy. Don't forget to connect the map sensor harness right there, and then we're just going to bolt it back down. Hey, air filter only goes in one way, that way, and put the housing back on. So let's get the ductwork back in. Little trick if you have a Saturn Vue, just pop it in like that, rotate, and it will rotate back into the socket there. Very easy. Coming back here, just make sure the bung goes in the hole, and then just push this back and put onto the airbox assembly. So the ductwork's back in, we've got our clasps back on the airbox assembly, the 10mm bolts in, it's all tightened down. Now we're going to put the negative terminal back on the battery. And don't forget to top up your coolant. And last of all, the plastic toggles, put the panel back on. So everything's back on. Let's start the car and see if it doesn't explode. So I haven't started it yet, so we're all doing it together. Let's go. There we go, it works. Now your engine light, if you did have one, will reset because we disconnected the battery. So drive around Again, if it wasn't routine maintenance and it was due to a problem, I hope it fixes it. If not, there are other things you can do if you haven't gone through the whole routine of checking everything. So yeah, that was an adventure. It took around 4 hours with the filming and a few breaks. It's not about the speed, it's about accuracy, just making sure you get it right. So over the next couple of weeks, just monitor your driveway for puddles of oil or anything like that. Things happen, no one's perfect, we are fallible. That is how to do it. It's an ultimate guide. It covers pretty much everything you need to know. I'm not into 2-minute videos. If you want to check out 2-minute videos, we have Scotty Kilmer and people like that for that. So this is here to educate you as well as doing things yourself, learning something and giving you a bit of satisfaction. So that is how to do a valve adjustment, intake and exhaust on a Honda J series engine. I hope it helped you. Thank you, like and subscribe, and thank you for watching. If this video really helped you, you saved so much money in the mechanic, then please donate a couple dollars below. It goes towards my beer fund to help keep me nice and sane and help support the channel. Thank you.